Shavua Tov, everyone. Shavua Tov. May it be a wonderful week for all. And I know it will be because we're starting it off with such a special opportunity. I've loved just listening in over the last few minutes to reunion and giving a chance for Glenn to connect to comrades and fellow activists
Comrades, oh.
over the years. And just for you to see him and for him to see you, it's one of the blessings of this Zoom opportunity. And we're so blessed, Glenn, to get a chance to hear from you on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Leningrad Trials, an opportunity to pause and reflect on the story of the struggle to free Soviet Jewry and the way in which one, two individuals can make all the difference. And anyone who has known Glenn over the years, I'll just speak for myself, has been blown away by your quiet heroism, your tireless devotion, the way you get things done to create a rally, a protest in what feels like a moment's time, but I know is hours and hours of arranging and organizing, from signs to permits to sound to gently pushing the right people to the front, always quietly in the back, but truly, truly leading the way, Glenn. And I know this is an opportunity to share stories, reflections, recollections, but I want to begin with our collective Hakarat Tov, the story of the journey to free Soviet Jewry, and the story of the awakening of activism in the American Jewish community is a story which cannot be told without the story of Glenn Richter. So Glenn, we're indebted to you, and the fact that your work continues as we've partnered on the Tisha B'Av program each year, and just at every opportunity, you're there at the ready to continue to fight the fight. And we, as a younger generation, are always learning and growing from your leadership. So we're looking forward to hearing these stories, remembering, recollecting, and also in the same breath being strengthened to continue to do the work that needs to be done on our fellow, for the sake of and along with our fellow Jewish brothers and sisters all around the world. So thank you, Glenn, and handing it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rev. Okay. Obviously, you can't do a huge amount in 45 minutes, but I'm going to try, and afterwards we're going to have Q&A. Okay, Shavua Tov, and many thanks for welcoming me into the virtual Bayit. For decades under Rav Avi's guidance, HIR was one of the most active shuls in America for Soviet Jews. Rav Avi and HIR were always there to help Avital Sharansky battle for her husband Natan's freedom. And if you were there, you'd never forget the incredible welcome Natan got at HIR, his first stop ever in America. I thought I'd tell you just some of the stories of the Soviet Jewry movement, what experts have called the most successful human rights campaign of modern times, and what I prefer to call a nace, a true miracle, a fulfillment of Hashem's promise to gather in his people from distant lands. We generally mark the beginning of the public Soviet Jewry movement in the US back to 1964. But you may have heard me mention Bernie Kabak, who's listening in, who actually ran a one-time demonstration in '62. That's a very interesting story, but Bernie's going to have to tell that separately. We knew Russian Jews were oppressed, but we had real few details. Earlier in 1956, a delegation from the Rabbinical Council of America had traveled to the USSR, but under strong restrictions. Moshe Dechter, a left-wing magazine editor, was secretly supported by Israel's clandestine Soviet Jewry office. In 1959, he published an entire issue of his magazine, The New Leader, about the situation of Soviet Jews, and in the early 1960s, elicited support among peace and civil rights notables to begin to speak out in protest. In April 1964, two gatherings kicked off the public American Soviet Jewry campaign. Establishment Jewish organizations met in Washington, D.C. Because of rivalries of who represented American Jewry, there was no appetite to create yet another umbrella group, this for Soviet Jews. So a paper group with no budget or staff of its own was announced, called the American Jewish Conference on Soviet Jewry. Meanwhile, back at the ranch here in New York, a small group of us headed by Yaakov Birnbaum called for a meeting of students at Columbia University. Several of us have been involved in the American Civil Rights Movement. Along with several colleagues, we said that if we can fight for the rights of Blacks in America, we can do so for our brethren in the USSR. Birnbaum himself was a most interesting person. His famed grandfather, Natan Birnbaum, coined the term Zionism in 1890. As a young child, Yaakov suffered in Hamburg under the Nazis until his father was able to take the family out to England, where the father became a censor of letters written in Yiddish to Jews in Britain. Yaakov told me that his father carried with him the burden of knowing through these letters the Nazis' destruction of European Jewry. After the war, Yaakov worked with British Jewish communal organizations and then decided to come to the US because he felt that the best way to redeem the 3 million Jews trapped in the USSR would be through American intervention. He rented a room in the apartment of YU's chief librarian to be near the campus so he could knock on dormitory doors and try to make the students aware of Soviet Jews' plight. All this came together at our meeting at Columbia University in 1964. This was generally not a time that most young American Jews would march in the streets for a Jewish cause. It was Pasnisht. Most of the Jews involved in the civil rights movement were not overtly identified as Jews. But as one who was involved in that movement in 63 and 64, I detected a yearning by my Jewish peers to participate in what they saw as a just cause. So when 150 students at Columbia University from a range of New York area colleges gathered, decided to go out on the street and protest at the Soviet mission 4 days later on May Day, the mood was electric. On May Day, 1,000 students appeared and marched with signs, but in silence, for 4 hours at the Soviet UN mission. We said that if Jews in Russia were forced into silence, so our demonstration would be silent. And that was the last time we made that mistake. We couldn't believe our eyes when the next day, the New York Times printed a substantial story about our demonstration on page 2, along with a photo. The photo was of my friend Tuvia, a Ger Tzedek, who looked very dignified in a suit, hat, and beard, and holding a sign. I joked with Tuvia the day before that to the press, he'd look like the quintessential Jew, and so it was. Yaakov had made up a rubber stamp with the name Students Struggle for Soviet Jewry. I told him that student struggle sounded better. So I took a razor blade and I cut off the offending S, and that's how we got our name. After running several follow-up demonstrations, we realized that our ad hoc group needed organizational structure. So from Yaakov's bedroom as headquarters, we graduated into a donated office on Whitehall Street at the southern tip of Manhattan. The Army Induction Center was directly across the street, and since this was the time of the Vietnam War, we watched boisterous anti-war demonstrations beneath our window. SSJ chapters began to spring up and around the New York area. My wife Lenore, who had joined the original May Day demonstration, became the chapter chair of the Stern College branch. We got married 3 years later. Without faxes or internet, the word of our activities slowly spread outwards across the US, and students joined up. Although some of our signs at our first demonstration bore the slogan, "Let my people go," it was more of a quote from Moshe to Pharaoh than what we could really conceive of as a possibility. At that point, the best we could hope for was expanded Jewish rights within the USSR. One of our 1964 demonstrations was in Atlantic City, New Jersey, outside the Democratic National Convention. We were thrilled when Bobby Kennedy came out to address our students. We held, for an example, a mass rally outside the Forward Building on the Lower East Side, and saw results when legislators, such as Senator Jacob Javits, spoke. We'd rent a sound truck for a noontime rally in the middle of the Garment District and have a built-in crowd. We benefited enormously from the young, charismatic rabbinical leadership of SSJ, such as our chairman, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, then of course Stevie, Rabbis Yitz Greenberg, Charles Shear, and later Rav Avi Weiss. The earlier group had received an haskama from their Rebbe, the Rav Soloveitchik, who told them to check with an expert in the field and see if open protests were worthwhile. Their expert said yes, and the Rav therefore said yes. What's the backstory? Well, in 1968, I had the privilege of driving the Rav back to Boston when the Greyhound bus Lenore and I and the Rav were on broke down on the highway. This was on a February and a short day and Friday. We had a 2.5-hour conversation with him. The Rav revealed to us that he always had felt guilty for not speaking up more during the Shoah, and we concluded that's why he left the door wide open for agreeing to public protest, while his more Haredi rabbinic contemporaries, who had lived under the Nazis and some under the Soviets, declined. Our efforts got a big push by Elie Wiesel. He was sent in 1965 by the Israelis to Russia, managed to speak to many Jews, mostly fearful, and wrote a searing account in his book, The Jews of Silence. Wiesel ended his book with these accusatory words, quote, "What torments me most is not the Jews of silence I met in Russia, but the silence of the Jews among whom I live today," close quote. Wiesel appreciated our activities and spoke at our rallies. We got another bump upwards when Arthur Morse's revelations about the relative silence of American Jewry during the Shoah, called While 6 Million Died, was published 2 years after Wiesel's book. Students began saying that although they couldn't fix the past in their parents' generation, they could make sure that silence when Jews were now in danger wouldn't happen again. Israel's miraculous victory in the 1967 Six-Day War deeply affected Soviet Jews. We heard stories that most young Jews would greet each other like this, putting their hand over one eye, like Moshe Dayan and his eye patch. The Kremlin-controlled media went into an anti-Semitic frenzy. The Yiddish neshama of Jews in Russia, which was almost extinguished in the European parts of this vast country, 11 time zones wide, was relit. On Simchat Torah and other Chagim, young Jews in several cities gathered outside the few remaining shuls, not to daven, they didn't know how, and the shuls were controlled by the KGB anyway, but just to be with each other. In Latvia, which was not Soviet until World War II, brave Holocaust survivors began to teach Hebrew and Judaism secretly. Outside of Riga, young Jews, including Yosef Mendelevich, would meet at Rumbeli, the site of a horrific Nazi massacre, to clean up the site and tend to the mass graves. The Israeli government was in a quandary. The Kremlin had broken diplomatic relations after the Six-Day War, and Israeli diplomats, some of whom had made quiet connections with Russian Jews, were expelled. When a delegation of the small number of Soviet Jews allowed to emigrate in the mid-1960s visited Golda Meir to urge her to speak out on behalf of their brethren, she told them, quote, "Put 7 locks on your mouths," unquote. Now remember, by the way, that Golda Meir in 1948 was Israel's ambassador to the Kremlin, and Jews who had greeted her at the remaining synagogue over there, many of those people had been arrested. So perhaps that was something to do with it. Then, a year after the Six-Day War, we heard a lone, eloquent voice. It was from a Jew in Kiev, Boris Kachabayevsky, who wrote a series of open appeals demanding exit visas for his family to Israel. A week before his arrest, his appeal declared, "I am a Jew. I want to live in the Jewish state. This is my right. I want to live in Israel. This is my dream, not only my goal, but also the lives of hundreds of generations preceding me. I want my children to study in Hebrew, to read Jewish newspapers, attend the Jewish theater. What's wrong with that? What's my crime? Let me go. As long as I live, as long as I am capable of feeling, I'll devote all my strength to obtain an exit visa to Israel. And if you should find it possible to sentence me for this, if I live long enough to be freed, I'll be prepared to make my way on foot even on foot to the homeland of my ancestors," unquote. He was sentenced to 3 years in the Gulag for anti-Soviet defamation. We finally had found a hero. Our New England SSJ branch published hundreds of large posters of Kochubeyevsky's words printed over his portrait. We quoted him at demonstrations and meetings time and again. Beamed into the USSR by Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty by shortwave radio, through Soviet jamming, thousands of Russian Jews heard his voice and heard his words, I should say, and became emboldened. Slowly, more individuals than collective appeals were smuggled out that echoed back through these radio transmissions. The most eloquent of the collective appeals at that time was from 18 religious Jewish families in Soviet Georgia. There, the Jews are tough and resisted the Kremlin's forced assimilation. In 1969, the 18 families wrote a series of open appeals. The first was a lengthy litany of why they wanted to emigrate to Israel. They ended, quote, "We will wait months and years. We will wait all our lives if necessary, but we will not renounce our faith or our hopes. We believe our prayers have reached God. We know our appeals will reach people. We ask, let us go to the land of our forefathers," close quote. The Israeli government again found itself in a quandary. Their official modus operandi was to pressure behind the scenes. Those who founded the secret Israeli-Soviet Jewry office called Nativ, the Path, or Lishkat HaKesher, the Liaison Bureau, had been involved in the pre-state illegal Aliyah Bet, and then quiet work through the Israeli embassy in Moscow before it was shut, and then in the Mossad. But events had finally overtaken this policy. More appeals emerged from the USSR, broadcast back through American transmissions or published in the foreign media. The Lishka sent tourists with non-Israeli passports into the USSR to meet with Jews and return with information and other appeals. In November 1969, Golda Meir, who had previously counseled silence, took the podium of the Knesset and read out the appeal of the Georgian 18 and other individual Soviet Jews. 10-second break. But still, the Lishka wanted to exert control over the growing Soviet Jewry movement in the West, where since the Six-Day War, we dropped our demands for better treatment of Jews within the USSR and focused on emigration to Israel. In the summer of 1970, my wife Lenore and I visited Israel for the first time. We made an appointment with Nehemia Levanon, the Lishka's director, at his nondescript office in the Kiryat, the government complex in Tel Aviv. Nehemia was one tough cookie. He had come on Aliyah from Latvia, helped found Kibbutz Kfar Blum, and worked in Aliyah Bet. He had been thrown out of Russia in the 1950s after the KGB discovered that he was using his diplomatic cover to meet with Russian Jews. Nehemia took a drag on his ever-present cigarette and asked us, "Who tells you what to do?" Like a bunch of naive Americans that we were, we replied, "We do what we think is right." Nehemia was scandalized. He shot back, "Your problem is that you don't take orders." We had no understanding of his mindset, nor he of ours. Relations between the Lishka and Triple SJ remained frosty, except for 3 wonderful weeks in 1977, when Menachem Begin was elected prime minister and Nehemia thought he'd lose his job. When that didn't happen, the gates slammed down again. But about the same time as our meeting with Nehemia, something else happened which changed the whole Soviet Jewry movement. An underground network of Jewish activists began to coalesce in the USSR 2 years before, whose extent was unknown even to the Lishka. At the end of 1969, activists in Leningrad and Riga, among others cities, started to discuss an idea of filling a Soviet airliner with Jews desperate to emigrate, taking over the plane in the air and flying it over the border to freedom. Organizers began to ask around to their family and friends who weren't as tight-lipped as the core group. Plus, of course, the KGB tapped the phones. So soon the plot was found out. Disagreements broke out among the organizers, and they decided to ask the Israeli government for advice. Now, in Jerusalem, I had the privilege of meeting with the person who actually brought out that question, a guy named Rami Aronson, who's a Norwegian Jewish doctor sent to Russia by the Lishka. Remember that this was a time of Palestinian and radicals hijacking of planes in the West. So the answer came back in a phone call to the Jews in Russia. You asked if your mother-in-law should take the medication. The answer is absolutely not. But a much smaller group of activists in Leningrad and Riga, including Mendelevich, didn't take no for an answer and quietly switched plans to fill not a big airliner, but the 12 seats of a Soviet biplane, which seemingly incredible, was scheduled to fly from Leningrad right next to the Soviet-Finnish border. The plan was to knock out the two pilots during a stop at a landing strip, remove them from the plane, bring aboard 4 others who would be hiding in the woods near that stop, then fly under the radar to Finland, give themselves up, and perhaps after imprisonment, be free to leave for Israel. What the plotters didn't realize is that the KGB had actually set up that route to entrap the Jews. The inevitable happened. The plotters lined up on the flight at the Smolny airport in Leningrad, but never touched the plane. They were jumped by the KGB. The 4 in the woods near the landing strip were grabbed. Members of the original canceled plot and unconnected Jewish activists were arrested in several Soviet cities. What was called the Leningrad Trial in December 1970, exactly 50 years ago, of the group which tried to board the biplane became an international sensation, especially when the court announced predetermined sentences of many years in the Gulag to death for 2 defendants. The KGB had succeeded in breaking only one of those arrested in the roundup. At the trial after sentencing, Silva Zalmanson, one of the defendants, stood up and declared in Hebrew, L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. We, the Jewish establishment, we in SSJ, the Jewish establishment, the Jewish Defense League, all demonstrated repeatedly at the Soviet UN mission, only one location of many actions in the US, across Europe, and in Israel. Almost exactly 50 years ago today, the Soviets canceled the death sentences to long labor terms and reduced a few other lengthy prison sentences. This showed us that the Kremlin responded to intense pressure, but a backstory came out only later. So what was the story? Prime Minister Golda Meir had sent an emissary to Spanish dictator Franco with an urgent message. We know you're descended from Jews at the time of the Inquisition. If you, the fascist, commute the death sentences handed out to 6 Spanish Basque separatists, then Brezhnev, the communist, will try to show he's more humane. Franco commuted. The Kremlin staged the Leningrad and subsequent trials to terrorize Jews from applying to emigrate to Israel. Exactly the opposite happened. Thousands risked losing their jobs and their children's places in school for asking to leave. Underground Jewish groups sprang up in cities across the USSR. Senator Scoop Jackson and Congressman Charles Vanek submitted ultimately successful legislation tying trade credits to Russia with greater freedom of emigration. I knew that the Soviet Jewry movement had actually made it to American public consciousness when in 1976 on national TV, a Saturday Night Live segment had comedian Gilda Radner's character, Emily Teller, go on a rant confusing Soviet jewelry with Soviet Jewry. And yes, you can still find that segment on YouTube. For myself, a defining moment came about a year later. On a cold December night in Moscow, my friend Maury Shapira and I set out for the home of a key refusenik, Vladimir Slepak. His building on Gorky Street wasn't that hard to find. A statue of Prince Jewry, the long arm, convincingly pointed the way, or conveniently pointed the way. We had been at Slepak's home the night before, meeting with refusenik leaders, delivering material assistance and Jewish items. We discussed the work of the SSJ, and even at that point, 10 years from our origin, how proud we were of the meaningful change the movement was making in the lives of so many young North American Jews. Well, we never made it into Slepak's apartment the second time. 3 cars full of KGB agents moved alongside us as we walked into the sleigh-packed building's courtyard. The intimidation worked. Not wanting these thugs to follow us into the apartment, we zipped out of the courtyard, jumped into the metro, and kept riding around. At midnight, we returned to Slaypak, who met us at his door with his black, monster-sized dog named Akhbar. Akhbar, of course, means mouse, which means, where were you? He demanded. We stammered about the KGB. We're not afraid, Volodya said. Why should you be? By the way, Akhbar had gained a reputation for attempting to bite KGB agents who regularly invaded Slaypak's apartment. Finally, the KGB had enough. One more time they warned Slaypak and we'll just shoot the dog. Volodya was sentenced to Siberian exile for 5 years after he and his wife Masha hung a banner from their balcony. Let us join our son in Israel. Finally, 13 years after Mori and I met them, Volodya and Masha finally received exit visas to Israel. Akhbar himself was earlier taken to Israel by their son and lived out his life in freedom with no KGB agents left to chomp on. Many US senators and congressmen were terrific on the issue of Soviet Jews, making statements on the floor of each house, passing resolutions, and defeating repeated attempts to cancel the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, linking trade credits with the USSR to free immigration. In the White House, the evolution was slower. You may recall that President Nixon had a secret recording system installed. In 2012, a 1973 tape of President Nixon's conversation with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was released. They had just said goodbye to visiting Golda Meir, who thanked them for American support and urged the president to pressure the Kremlin for the release of their Jews. Now I'm quoting Kissinger, quote, "The emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. And if they put Jews in gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern, maybe a humanitarian concern," close quote. Nixon, quote, "I know, we can't blow up the world because of it," close quote. By the next administration, the White House's tune changed, and I think we all recall President Ronald Reagan's successful attempts not only to pressure the Kremlin on human rights, but also to ultimately push the USSR into oblivion. 10 seconds. One of the principles of SSJ's action was to go where the action is to go where the action is. That's what led our chairman, Rav Avi Weiss, who had taken over when Rav Riskin went on Aliyah, myself and 5 colleagues, including, and well, we'll talk about it later. Okay. We went to Red Square on a sunny day in May 1988, when President Reagan went with Mikhail Gorbachev during the USSR summit. We had shadowed Mr. Reagan first to Helsinki, Finland, where he stopped for a couple of days to adjust to European time. With the help of Christian evangelicals, we set up a mock Russian prison cage in a square in the center of Helsinki to symbolize Jews still trapped in the USSR. These evangelicals believed that in the prophecy that Soviet Jews would escape to the north on the way to Israel, and it set up temporary shelters to house them. When the gates actually began to open, tens of thousands of Soviet Jews did indeed pass through Finland on their way to Israel. Back to Red Square. When the onion domes of the Basel Cathedral to our back and led into, or with the onion domes of the Basel Cathedral to our back and Lenin tombs to our front, we quickly pulled out the signs for Soviet Jews and their freedom, blew shofrot, put on talitot, and prayed. The KGB, of course, arrived in a flash, but stood back, unwilling to attack us because the international media, which we had tipped off in Helsinki, was covering us. But then a foreign correspondent questioned a man in the crowd of curious Russian onlookers. "What do you think of these Jews demonstrating?" The man replied loudly, "What about my problem? I've been out of work for 5 years." No bank of TV cameras protected this poor guy. Within 2 minutes, a gray KGB car pulled up, he was thrown in and taken away. We have no idea what happened to him. We were protected by the presence of the media. He was not. As we finished our action, a very big guy came over to me and identified himself as, quote, a Russian journalist. Behind his back, the real correspondents were pointed to him and mouthed to me, KGB, KGB. This big guy whipped out a tape recorder and demanded, who sent you? Who paid for you? So what do you say to the KGB in Red Square? Well, I told him that we were just a group of friends who felt so strongly about the plight of Jews in the USSR, we felt compelled to come all the way to Moscow and show our support. I left out the part about Triple SJ. A few hours later, we stood outside Spaso House, the American ambassador's residence, as Reagan met with refuseniks and dissidents. I suddenly saw Mr. Big Guy nearby, but again, the foreign press was there. All Big Guy could do was wave at me, and I in turn at him. However, had this been a dark Moscow alley at 3 o'clock in the morning, I probably would have emerged a few feet shorter than I am today. Shortly thereafter, I had to accompany one of our team to a Moscow airport to get him back to Leningrad. But Rabbi Weiss and the 4 others joined refuseniks demonstrating for their freedom outside the Lenin Library. By that point, the KGB wasn't feeling so kind and started attacking the refuseniks. As the secret police began to close in on our contingent, a Canadian TV news team pulled up in their van. A cameraman inside shouted, "Jump in, we'll save you." So our guys threw themselves in the van, which zoomed away from the KGB. 7 months later, Gorbachev came to New York to address the UN, and we staged a vigil outside. Rabbi Weiss told our assembled students how he and his colleagues demonstrating with refuseniks at the Gorby-Reagan summit was saved by a Canadian TV news team. As he spoke, a TV cameraman who was lying quietly on his back on the ground, videotaping us, looked up and said, "Rabbi Weiss, I was that cameraman inside the van who yelled at you to jump in." Believe it or not, that really happened. And a year after that, the ground began to shift again. As Soviet satellite countries began to break away and the Kremlin's hold on its Baltic states loosened, Jews from around the USSR boldly met in Riga in late 1989 to declare a federation of Soviet Jewish communities called the VAD. Rabbi Weiss and I attended on behalf of Triple SJ, marveling at the change, and Rabbi Weiss engaged in almost non-stop kiruv work. In February 1991, when the Soviets tenuously held on to their last months in power, my late Triple SJ colleague Henry Gerber and I attended the VAD's first open conference in Moscow, as anti-Semites demonstrated outside. It felt unbelievable. Henry and I left the gathering to board the first official El Al flight from Moscow to Israel. When that big, beautiful Magen David on El Al's 757 tail appeared outside the terminal window, it seemed like a dream. We picked up a plane full of Russian Jewish Olim in Budapest and landed in the middle of the Scud War. Saddam Hussein's missiles came from the USSR. Now, 29 years on, the world has changed. Our fervent tefillot were answered. The gates of the USSR were opened. Chabad has breathed life, Jewish life, into many of the 15 countries that used to be the USSR. The largest Jewish community center in the world is in Ukraine. There might never be democracy in Russia under Putin, but Jews are a somewhat tolerated, protected minority, and Israel has been able to some extent moderate Kremlin support for Arab despots. Israel is a home to over 1.5 million Soviet Jews and their descendants who have transformed the face of the country. Russian Airlines has 5 flights a day from Moscow to Israel. Last year, Henry and I traveled to Moscow on the way to Israel. I had the pleasure of standing peacefully in that same spot in Red Square where we demonstrated 31 years before. We ate in kosher restaurants, visited several of the dozens of shuls in Moscow, as well as the magnificent Jewish museum, which even displayed a couple of our Triple SJ protest posters. Little did we know 56 years ago what Hashem's plans would bring. So let's recognize it for the miracle it surely is. Shavua Tov. Q&A. Hi there, anybody there?
Thanks, Glenn, so much. I see Beth just raise your hand, either using the raise hand function or raise your hand. Just in terms of our timing, we'll do around 10-15 minutes of Q&A, and then I would love if Rav Avi closed us out after the Q&A, just as a sign off. Would be such a privilege to hear from you, Rav Avi, reflections or comments. So I'm going to call on Beth first.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Richter, thank you for that wonderful presentation.
Your name is Glenn.
Glenn, okay. As a career librarian, I've watched the kids in the Jewish day schools and the next generation not really knowing enough about the Soviet Jewry movement. I did my best where I work to educate the kids. I'm going to give you a mission tonight to think of writing a book on the movement that would be appropriate for, let's say, I don't know, maybe fifth grade and up, and just for kids, because it would really help to educate the next generation about this miracle that was brought in our lifetime. So I want you to think about that.
Okay, the short answer is that there have been a few attempts, but probably the most successful one has been a curriculum set up through the initiation of the daughter of two of the Leningrad hijack plotters, a young lady named Anat Zalmanson-Kuznetsov, who has worked with a university, with Bar Ilan University in Israel, to set up a curriculum. So if you would ask the HIR office for my email, then I will be happy to put you on to that curriculum.
Thank you.
By the way, my cousin Debbie Hirsch asked a question I saw on the screen. It said, what do my parents think? My parents were not happy at the beginning, but afterwards became to realize that this is really what I wanted to do. And I had been for 1 year in law school, but I don't think I would have been a too successful lawyer when I really wanted to be an activist.
Glenn, there's a question here that came in the private chat. Could you speak to the controversy between American Jewish groups and the Israeli government over where Soviet Jews should settle?
Yeah, that sort of consumed the American Jewish establishment in the mid 1980s. We at SSJ try to keep out of this because there's only everybody's energy was getting sucked into that rather than trying to fight the Soviet Union to actually let Jews out. And the Israeli government's position was, look, Soviet Jews are saying they want to get out in order to go to Israel. That was the way. You couldn't say, I wanted to go to rich America and become a rich American capitalist. But so Soviet Jews, of course, most of whom didn't have, much of a Jewish background. So by God, the doors are open. Who knows how long they're going to be open? Let's just try to get out when we can get out. And it got to the point where 70-80% of Soviet Jews who were coming out were not going on to Israel. Remember, Israel was being presented in the Soviet media as a hot, small, very, very dangerous place in which the talents of Soviet Jews would not be appreciated. And of course, the reports back from some of the Soviet Jews who got there was not great. People with PhDs were sweeping streets. It took a decade or two until things were being sorted out. So so finally, after a lot of pushing behind the scenes, there was a sort of an arrangement made by the late 1980s that Soviet Jews would actually, if they're saying they're going to Israel, would go to Israel. On the other hand, there was an amendment by Senator Lattenburg of New Jersey, passed in Congress, called the Lattenburg Amendment, that said that if Soviet Jews actually ended up going to America, they would be considered refugees because per force, by being a Soviet Jew, you were being persecuted. But it really ended up that by the end, most Soviet Jews started going to Israel. That's a short answer to a very long and hot topic.
Thanks, Glenn. One question came in was, was there any cooperation or coordination or overlap between the SSSJ and the JDL? Could you speak about that relationship?
Okay, the relationship was tense. In the beginning in 1965, I remember, even in 1964, when Rabbi Kahana was an editor at the Jewish Press, he was very, very supportive of us because he said, "You guys are doing something." By 1968, the Jewish Defense League was formed, if you remember, first to defend Jews in Brooklyn, and then Rabbi Kahana realized that Soviet Jewry and the relative quietude of the American Jewish establishment was a very hot topic. So he got onto that in 1968. And it was tense because the JDL guys with Rabbi Kahana would stand in back of our students at the Soviet, you were demonstrating at the Soviet mission, and push them into the police. Now, the police at that point were on real horses, not the wooden sawhorses, but on real horses. So the police made no distinction. These were just Jews pushing, or seeming to be pushing. So the kids in the front, who were our kids, were getting their heads knocked in. We had a meeting at Rabbi Riskin's office with Rabbi Kahana, I think with Rav Avi Weiss, myself, a couple of others. And finally, after 2 hours, we thought we had an agreement with Rabbi Kahana not to engage in that kind of activity. At the end of the meeting, Rav Kahana said to us, "I'm not bound by any agreement, by any promise I made." Now, I think Rabbi Weiss has a much longer, more history with it, and of course, it's much more nuanced than that. The Jewish establishment wanted to totally wipe JDL out of the history of the Soviet Jewry movement. The answer is, I felt that even though those who engage in violence will be consumed by violence, which is what happened, it came, their threats of violence and the violence that they engage in, and in one time it was tragically ended up in a death of a woman named Iris Cones, had a place. We would not have engaged in this. Our background was a civil rights movement. But when you look back at the long history of the Soviet Jewry movement, the violence and the threats of violence actually pushed the American government and the Soviet government. But again, those who engage in violence are going to get consumed by it. And that's what happened.
Thank you. There's a question here about, do you guys have archives for the SSSJ? Is that all in your house? Or
oh my God, my house looks stuffed. What's the idea? But no,
yeah?
the house is stuffed to the gills. A subatomic particle can't even get in. But the answer is no. Yeshiva University very, very kindly has done a stand-up job of putting together the SSSJ archives. And if you Google Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, Yeshiva University archives, you got to find pages and pages and pages and pages. And when the university is open, at this point, because of COVID, it's not available, you could go in, make an appointment, and go through the 26 years of our archives to your heart's extent. The Center for Jewish History also has a Soviet Jewry archives for some other organizations. In Israel, there are archives. There are archives at Ariel University and also the Zionist archives. But again, if you need to do research, call Dr. Shuli Berger, Chief Archivist at YU, and she'll be glad to set you up to go through archives. Many people who have done research and books have used it.
Thank you. There's a question that came in about, I guess for the student struggle, was it, all the chairmen, was Rav Avi and Rabbi Riskin, Rabbi Greenberg, were there conservative and reform Jews or leadership involved in the student struggle or the kinds of actions you guys were taking?
That's a really very good question. It's a little interesting because in New York, the core of the group is really Orthodox. And I guess because it began at YU and also it began at JTS. And at that time, JTS was far more traditional than it is today. Outside of New York, it was not so. Out of New York, there were many, many young Jews involved who were not observant on a religious level, but Jewishly conscious. And by the way, I want to say something, that SSSJ never promoted itself as a Zionist organization, but I would bet that more people associated with us ended up going in Aliyah than members of some other, possibly some other Zionist organizations.
That's great. Thank you. Somebody, Janet Hoffman, wrote that we were sent to meet with refuseniks in 1978 through some kind of Israeli government Jewish agency initiative, and was SSSJ aware of that?
Yes. Okay, now a little bit behind the scenes. Yeah. Between roughly 69 and roughly 1989, roughly over 20 years, this Lishka, the Soviet Jewry office, sent the neighborhood of about 8,000 people into the Soviet Union to meet with Soviet Jews. These people had, of course, foreign passports, not Israeli passports. What happened, however, was a problem that when these people came back, they were told, write up your report. In some cases, people were told not to even talk about it, not to even talk to anybody else about their trip. Write up your report and submit it. We found that these reports, which had extraordinarily valuable information, were going into a black hole, into the Lishka. So over the course of time, since many people recommended other people to be traveling, people would also quietly make a second copy of their report and slip it to us. So in our archives, you can find some of the reports that originally went to the Lishka. But it was a problem because the Lishka used information as a weapon. They weaponized information. So if the activists, the independent activists didn't have the information, they couldn't be as efficient. So what happened was we simply developed our own sources of information inside the Soviet Union.
Thank you. How did the New York Conference on Soviet Jewry fit into the movement?
The New York Conference on Soviet Jewry, by the way, was set up early in the game, but again, it didn't have really a budget or a staff. After 1971, after the first Leningrad trial, with the pushing of the Lishka, it did have a budget and a staff. But again, they were the establishment, we were the activists, there was tension, there were certainly times that we worked together. And one example was a big rally in December 1971. Here's the backstory. Two people, Azriel and Ahuva Genek, who live on the Upper West Side, said, let's do a rally in Madison Square Garden. Now, right. So, of course, like, who tells us you can't do it, right? So, this is not the establishment, you can't do it. So they worked and worked and worked. Now, who could supply the money? Well, the answer was right up in Riverdale, the Bentheims lend the money to rent out Madison Square Garden. We were going great guns and we were beginning to fill the seats, and we realized that we certainly could use the help of the Jewish establishment at that point it was called the New York Conference on Soviet Jewry. So they helped fill up the seats. We filled up the seats. We had a slam bang rally. There was no empty seat in the house. And that was a time of cooperation, but there were certainly times of tension. There were times that personally Rabbi Weiss was being insulted by the people involved. But again, you try to put some things behind you at this particular point, looking backwards in history. But I think that our job was really, and Rabbi Weiss, I think, has said it many, many times, you see the Soviet Jewry movement as an orchestra, okay? The establishment were the flautists, we were the drummers, we pushed.
Thanks, Glenn. Harriet is asking if there were non-Jewish groups who participated in the student struggle or in the movement in general. And was that connected to earlier coalitions that had been formed during civil rights or separate? Could you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think that Moshe Dechter, whom I had mentioned early in the beginning, who was a leftist. By the way, his ex-wife was Midge Dechter. I don't know if you remember from way back when in Commentary Magazine, but the famous author Midge Dechter. Anyway, Moshe Dechter really, really paved the way by connecting with peace activists, civil rights activists, and because some of us had the background in the civil rights movement, so certainly early in the game, we very much appreciated their efforts. Then as things happen, you end up largely traveling on your own road. During times of big rallies, there were certainly people who were non-Jewish representatives, civil rights representatives, who ended up speaking at some of the rallies. Certainly there were non-Jews who came to rallies and demonstrations, but it was absolutely in Congress and on the state and county and city level, when we needed assistance or resolutions or whatever would be done, there were wonderful, wonderful people. And of course, the prime example were Javits Lenore was Jewish. Okay, but Senator Scoop Jackson and Senator Charles Vanek were the best examples. Two non-Jews who said, we have to do something. And they pushed through legislation, which was initially, by the way, being undermined by the establishment. And even after it was passed, some of the Jewish establishment people also were trying to undermine it. But that's a different story. That's not for this purpose. So yes, the answer is it was much appreciated. And there were some wonderful people. There was a thing set up by the establishment called the Interreligious Task Force in Soviet Jewry, set up by the late and sainted Sister Ann Gillen. Sister Rose Thering at Seton Hall University was very, very helpful. So I think that we got support when we asked for it.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm gonna ask you one final question, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Rav Avi to share to close us out. So my question for you is, what do you think is sort of the biggest issue today that you wish Jews were rallying around or doing, the next generation of a movement in this way? What are the most vulnerable populations or causes, that are reflective of Jewish values or Jewish peoplehood that you would love to see being activated on?
Okay, I think obviously the whole background, the background beat is Jewish unity, which is hard because everybody says unify around what I think is unity, but certainly it's Israel, and I think we shouldn't kid ourselves. We live in our own little Jewish bubbles here on the west side of Manhattan, in Riverdale, wherever we are. We live in our own little Jewish bubbles, but the answer is Israel is certainly needs all the protection it can get, and to the extent that we can work together, even with people who don't always agree with us, but where circles intersect, let's work together. It's not easy. It really isn't easy. But the answer is Israel has to be the one. And I think we tend, after most of our lives, if not all our lives, there was an Israel, we tend to take it for granted. It really can't be. It really, really can't be. That's the one place we have to work heart and soul for, if possible, Jewish unity on Israel, and certainly working out and getting wider support for Israel.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I'm going to ask Rav Avi to speak now.
Thank you, Rav Ezra. Can I be heard, Ez?
Yeah, we hear you. We see.
Okay, great. Just thank you so much, Glenn, for allowing us to relive these moments. It's uplifting to hear you recount all those stories and those decades of struggle. And as you know, Glenn, so many people on this Zoom were a part of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, or in their way played a very major part.
I hope you mentioned a certain Glickman.
Bernie Glickman of blessed memory.
Okay.
Jack Lew, who worked from the inside. He was in government, but he played a very major role, being a close confidant of Natan and that big rally. And maybe Gary Rosenblatt is on. I think he was the journalist par excellence who made sure that we knew about what was happening. And you know who else is on, Glenn? Michael and Orly, the Ables. I saw that they were on. Of course, they were on with the Union of Councils and Pam Cohen. It became, as you pointed out, a movement of a symphony with everybody being part of the symphony, people playing a role in different ways. And for myself, I know in hindsight, I looking back, talking very personally, I was very anti-establishment. And today, I think looking back with the wisdom of hindsight of years, I'm more non-establishment. Anti-establishment means I never understood the role the establishment played. But in hindsight, I recognized that what I believed was a cacophony was really a symphony, and we really joined in this together. And one of the great moments for the Bayit was when Natan came out, and his first public address in America in May 1986 was at the Bayit. So we made sure, the leadership of the Bayit made sure that conservative and reform rabbis joined and participated and sang a few words and sang psalms. And some of you may remember we were roundly criticized, but this was a movement across the denominations. This was a movement of young and old. It was extraordinary. And Glenn, I think you're so right. I think the focus now has to be on the state of Israel. To all the progressives who are progressive on the gay issue, on environment, on racial issues, God bless you, on feminist issues. But in that community, Israel is viewed as a colonial state, when in fact, Israel today, looking at the Middle East and the world, is such a progressive country. And it's here that I think we all have to coalesce. And just as Soviet Jewry was not popular when you started, Glenn, but it was the right thing to do. So for those who would say, but Israel is not popular on campus, it's the right thing to do. And it's there that I think we can coalesce and speak out for the state of Israel. But for me, and here, I want to just focus a few words about the two people whom I think are the heroes, Yaakov Birnbaum of blessed memory, who was the patriarchal figure. He, I believe, was one of the first. Many of his ideas were later adopted by the establishment. And my heart is very heavy as I recall many, many events where Yaakov, in front of the establishment, would get up to speak and he would be mocked. And it pains me very much when I remember that. He's really one of the great heroes. And of course, Glenn, who is my teacher, who was my Rebbe. We just heard tonight one of the greats, one of the great activists of our time. Glenn Richter, for me, is the most knowledgeable person today in Soviet Jewry. During that movement, his motto was a motto of giving, giving, and giving. Glenn worked from 1964 to 1991 as the head, together with Yaakov, of this triple SJ. If his salary went above $12,000, $13,000, most of the years, one year it hit 18 or 19, that was a lot. And I have deep regrets about that when I became chairman, I didn't understand that should have truly been a great priority. And Glenn is so unassuming and so humble, it drives me crazy, but you've just listened to one of the greats. And this modest book called Open Up the Iron Door is dedicated to Glenn. Perhaps you could see his picture. Glenn Richter with his famous cap. And it reads, for Glenn Richter, tzaddik of the Soviet Jewry movement. And in the book talks about the influences and inspirations. And I want to read to you something you don't know about Glenn. We all know how he worked day and night. But there's a paragraph that reads, Glenn's passion never faltered, even after he and Lenore is Glenn's wife, saw their only children, Talia and Chana, born with life-threatening maladies, die very young. During their short lives, the children needed volunteers to do physical exercises with them, and many activists joined in this effort. An extraordinary photograph of Avital Sharansky exercising with Talia, Glenn and Lenore's oldest daughter, appeared on the front page of an Anglo-Jewish magazine. Avital also organized the recital of prayers from the Book of Psalms for Glenn's children at our home in Jerusalem. This gives you just a small idea of who Glenn was and Lenore is, who they are for many, many more years to come. And it gives you a sense that as Glennon led for pittance 24/7, not even 24/6, 24/7, this was his life. As he led, he carried many, many personal issues that were devastating and still went forward. And for those who know Glenn, in the book is recorded some of Glenn's protests. Glenn has this wry New Yorker kind of way of speaking and great sense of humor. And so we write here, Glenn took protests to another level, adding spice and fun to draw attention to the serious plight of Soviet Jewry. A few examples, I'm just highlighting a few. This is what Glenn led. An exorcism ceremony at Aeroflot Soviet Airlines office to drive out the evil spirits of the Kremlin's anti-Semitism. Way to do it, Glenn. I still remember this one. A birthday cake inscribed with "Let my people go," delivered to the Soviet UN mission for a Kremlin leader's birthday. A circus of horrors for Soviet Jews outside the Moscow Circus at Madison Square Garden. This was Glenn. And we're about ready to observe the 50th anniversary of the 8th day of Hanukkah in 1970. Came out on December 30th, I believe, of this coming Wednesday. And it was then after Glenn and Yaakov heard, the world heard, that Soviet Jews on that plane, 2 of them were sentenced to death, Eduard Kuznetsov and Mark Dimshitz, and others, Yosef Mendelevich, Eduard Kuznetsov, to long sentences. There was a spontaneous flow into the streets of tens and hundreds of thousands. And everybody tried to do their share, as Glenn recorded. But I think it was mostly the people in the streets that the Soviets flinched. And for the first time in all of history, the Soviet Union, a Soviet court under the thumb of the Kremlin, bowed to international pressure. And those death sentences were commuted. And the long sentences, at least some of them, were shortened. And that sparked the Soviet Jewry movement. As a matter of fact, I believe, to use a Glenn word, it turbojetted, because it was a plane that they tried to get out. I think it turbojetted not only the Soviet Jewry movement, but the larger movement of dissidents in the Soviet Union and in the orbit states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, to rise up. And I think the Soviet Jewry movement ultimately contributed to the fall of communism. And so in tribute to Glenn, at the end of this book, I write that I think it's important that those who played a major role, that our youngsters should know their names. Young Jews today do not know the story of Soviet Jewry. They have no idea there are countless heroes living in their midst. They do not know the names of the stories of the real heroes, Soviet Jews themselves, nor do they know the names of their junior partners, the activists in the West who forced Gorbachev's hand. People like Abe Baer, Rabbi Saul Berman, Jacob Birnbaum, Shoshana Cardin, Pam Cohen, Rav Yitz Greenberg, Micah Naftali, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, Rabbi Charles Sherritt goes on, Lynn Singer, Judy Lash Bayland, it goes on and on and on. And then I write, and leading the way was a man to whom this memoir is dedicated, Glenn Richter. Forever etched in my mind is the first time I met Glenn in the late 1960s, sitting in his poorly lit, cramped office with papers stacked high on his desk, He was typing memos. Glenn was typing memos and newsletters and flyers. He was imploring, yes, begging for $1 and $2 donations in return for the many Save Soviet Jewry buttons, stickers, bracelets, and necklaces he sent in the mail. He was imploring the masses, especially students, to join in the protest movement for Soviet Jews. For 28 years, he sacrificed everything for his brothers and sisters, almost always people he did not know and he has never met. And I have been imploring Yeshiva University to offer an honorary doctorate to Glenn. An honorary doctorate was offered by Richard Joel to Yaakov. I'd like to see Glenn in that graduation.
Oh, no.
I
Oh,
want to
no.
see it, Glenn. You
No
deserve it.
penguin suits.
And the
No.
last paragraph reads, I have the floor, Glenn. With the help of God, the movement had a good ending. The meeting of Jews from the East with Jews from the West. That rendezvous echoed the biblical moment. By the way, we read about it this week. Echoed the biblical moment when Joseph and his brothers meet after 22 years of separation. When they finally see each other, Joseph asks his brothers, "Is my father still alive? Ha'od Avichai?" The question is left unanswered in the Bible. It was left to Glenn to lead our sisters and brothers from the Soviet Union thousands of years later to respond, Od Avinu Chai, yes, our Father is still alive. Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. You know, Shlomo's famous song, Rabbi Kalbach of blessed memory, Am Yisrael Chai, Od Avinu Chai. Virtually all the songs come from the Bible. Those words never appear anywhere. In the Bible, they're a question. Ani Yosef, I'm Joseph. Ha'od Avichai, is Abba still alive? And the song was a response heard all over the world. It was our We Shall Overcome song. And so in honor of that great, great movement, in honor of Yaakov, blessed memory, in honor of Glenn, in honor of our dear friend Yosef Mendelevich of Natan, in honor of all of you who participated in so many demonstrations, let's join together. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Yisrael Chai. O Davinu Chai, O Davinu Chai, O Davinu, O Davinu, O Davinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, O Davinu Chai. Glenn, we respect you, we love you. Thank you, Glenn. Love you.
Folks could feel free to unmute and offer a round of applause for Glenn and their
Thank you very much. Okay. Final word that the Soviet Jewry movement was not a me, it was successful because it was a we.
Yes.
Mazel tov, mazel tov.
Following the minhag of our Shavuot,
Mazel tov and Sherman tov.
following the minhag of our Motzei Shabbos program.